Hey everybody, this is John Wood and welcome back to Jay Wood Fly Fishing on YouTube. If you haven't subscribed already, please do. I'm going to be adding a lot more videos of fly tying over the next few weeks. Today I'm going to tie for you a bass fly that is as weedless as any fly can get. And it has to do with the design. I designed this over several years out of frustration after encountering some situations where there were bass feeding heavily in weeds, but I couldn't get to them and without my fly snagging up. So I just went to work and went through many designs, and this is what I finally came up with. And you can see the top on this thing is a piece of foam, and it's cut using a cutter that I had made for me by Tony Tomasu at River Road Creations. And I use that to make all of the components except for the eyes of this fly. The back obviously is a single piece, and the lift, the white foam you see in there, that 3mm piece, is cut using the nose end of the cutter. And then what I call the skid plate here on the bottom is cut using the tail of the cutter. And then the eyes are just a 1/2 inch long piece of a 1/4 inch diameter foam cylinder. So let's get started and I'll show you how to tie this thing. I'm going to start off with a TMCO hook, and this is their bass bug hook. It's the TMC 8089, and this is a size 2, and you can see it's an oversized hook. It's actually about the size of a 3/0. I can get my big old chubby index finger in there. It is big and it's super sharp. We're going to start with the point up. Get that level. And to protect my fingers, I'm going to use the tips that came off of a pair of tweezers. It's a hard plastic, and I put 1 drop of Solarez flex resin down in there and cured it. And what that does, it allows me to push that on there and lock it in place. For the thread, we're going to use a Uni 6/0 in red. I'm going to start it right behind the eye of the hook, work it back about 1/3 of the way, and then go right forward back to just behind the eye. Drop it back a little bit. Now I'm going to take a 1/4 inch piece of 2mm yellow foam. And let's just cut 1/4 inch wide, just a strip, and catch that in right at the end, and then wrap it down very securely to just a little over 1 hook eye length back from where I started. We're going to fold that forward, and now I'm going to take this 1/4 inch foam cylinder that's cut to a 1/2 length and position it so it's centered right on top of the hook shank. Fold my foam strap over, bring the thread back behind the eyes while pushing them towards the eye of the hook, and then wrap them in with a few wraps. And then I'm just going to clip that loose and wrap up the stub real good. Now at this point, if your eyes are not centered, you can twist them and they'll slide. It's a little bit of work, but you can move them a little bit side to side. I'm going to check that and make sure that they're centered up on the hook shank. Now let's flip that over. We're going to leave that hook guard on there because we're going to be grooming some marabou later on. Now we're just going to wrap a spiral thread base all the way back to the bend of the hook. and then make a few wraps right there, lock it in place. I'm going to take a marabou blood coil, just in a medium olive, and we're going to use the entire thing before we're done with this fly. But I'm going to start with about an inch and a half, maybe an inch and a quarter, inch and a half of barbs off of one side of the base end of the feather. Just pop those off. The butts are fairly even. I'm going to leave those on there. I'm going to use a little moisture off of my sponge cloth just to kind of gather the butts up. I want to measure that, make sure it's going to be long enough. Now you see the end of that are a little uneven, so I'm going to just pinch them and then pinch that end right off of there. Now I can measure that again, and I want it to be from the very front of the eye of the hook to the back of the bend of the hook. Lock that in, and then gather those butts and secure them in place. Now I want a little bit of flash, and we're going to use about 4 or 5 strands of root beer crystal flash. I think this is root beer pearl. And I want to, come on, double it over so the ends are even. Grab those ends and then cut them where they're looped. Now I'm going to hold them. I'm going to turn that way so you can see what I'm doing. Put them right on the side of the hook shank and lock them in place with a couple of thread wraps. And then I'm going to have to turn it back this way so I can control it. Wrap forward just a bit. Grab the ends that are pointing up towards the eye of the hook. Fold them over, and as you do, bring your thread around and then pull those back. And that's going to lock them right down to the side of that hook. And then you get to your base of your tail, gather everything and tie it off. Now if those are a little bit longer when you come out here, just clip them off. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to add some body flash. And for that I like UV copper polar chenille for this particular fly, which is made to imitate a bluegill. And I'm going to tie it in by the core so that the fibers point back and down. And that's going to help with our wrapping here in just a minute so that they are radiating outward away from the shank of the hook. Now I'm going to take some Winter Run Blue New Age chenille from Cascade Crest Tools. Tie it in right up here behind where I tied my eyes in. Strap it to the top of the hook shank all the way back to where everything else is tied in. Run this back forward, and then I'm going to just put that on there. Solid wraps all the way back up to just behind where the eyes were tied on. And if you'll notice, there's a little bit of a gap here between the eyes and the chenille. I'm going to bind that butt down, and now we're going to wrap the polar chenille. And I want about 5 wraps. And as we come around on the 5th one, I'm going to kind of work my thread through those fibers and lock that down, putting a lot of pressure on that thread. Go in front of it and then behind it and then in front of it, and that locks it down completely. It's not going anywhere. I'm going to cut that to where that butt is just long enough so that I can pull all the fibers back and then get in there and catch that butt with my thread. Get the rest of those polar fibers back. And I love this copper because it's just a really good color for imitating a bluegill. And plus there's a lot of UV strands in there, so it's got a lot of flash to it. Now the last thing we're going to do is wrap the collar and then add a little bit more marabou. So the extra marabou is going to come from the other side of the quill where we took the barbs off for the tail. So that same amount, you're just going to strip it from the quill. And then again with my little sponge cloth, I'm going to take a little moisture and bind the butts down a little bit. Then I'm going to take this cloth and I'm going to run the marabou through there and wet it really good so that it stays together, so I can drop it down on the table. And I can drop that and pick it up as many times as I want, and it's going to stay together. We're going to prep the marabou feather by grab it by the tip and then just start stroking the barbs towards the butt. And it's going to separate the barbs at the tip from the barbs going backward. And you see right there a couple of those pulled loose, so I'm going to pull the ones on the other side forward because we're going to use those barbs to help secure this feather on. So I've got those separated. The ones towards the butt are going back and the one towards the tip are going forward. Now I'm going to clip that out of there. And you can see I've got all of those barbs on either side of the quill. I'm going to lay that down to where when I wrap this back, let me get that back with a little moisture. Get that out of the way. There we go. Dry my fingers off. And when I lay that down, I'm going to bring the thread around and catch the quill and all those barbs right at the tip. And that makes that quite a bit more durable as opposed to just tying it in by the quill without the extra barbs to help it. Now with just a tiny bit of moisture, I don't want too much because I don't want to wet those. I just want them damp so they're not flying around. Just with my fingers, brush this marabou back and keep wrapping it in that tight little gap back on itself. But you've got to pull those barbs back so that they don't get caught in there between the quill and the hook shank. If they get caught in there, they're not going to be able to do what they're intended to do, which is get out in the water and call the fish with that sinuous movement that they've got. It's so tantalizing to the fish when this thing sits in the water. So I brought my quill around. Again, just a tad bit of moisture there to hold those down. I'm going to make 2 wraps and then hold that bobbin, that thread bobbin, so that I've got a lot of tension on that so the quill doesn't spring back. And then I'm going to bring it around and over the front of the eyes, and you see it pull that quill down right onto the top of the hook. I'm going to bind that down and then trim it. Now we're going to flip the hook over, or flip the vise over, so that the hook point is up. I'm going to groom that so all of those fibers are going straight back from where they're tied in. Now we're going to take this tuft that we pulled off, and I'm just going to barely trim the ends of it at the butt end. Then I'm going to put about 1/8 of an inch beyond the back of the eyes. Bring my thread back behind the eyes. Now we'll do that. Lay that in there and If you need to, you can moisten those butts just again, and it's just going to help you to control them. And then with a loose wrap, pull it down, kind of position them so they're right on top, and then you get a little pressure on it. And then I'm going to have to reach around here with my left hand, hold the tips of the barbs out of the way, and get several wraps in there. And you can see where that moisture comes in handy, because if you don't have the moisture on there, those marabou tips just fly around. And once you've got that secured, go ahead and flip the vice jaws over, pull those back, and bring your thread up in front of the eyes. I want to make sure all that stem and everything's bound down real good. Now we're going to put our bars on the marabou, and to do that we're going to use a Sharpie permanent marker, and I like brown for my bluegill. So this is just a brown Sharpie marker, and I'm just going to stroke everything back. And all of those barbs are about the same length, so you can get your fingers right out to the tip eventually. What I'm going to do is start up here at the front, mark down that side, and you need a pretty heavy mark on there for it to get through all of those barbs. Mark down that side, down this side. And it's easier, I'm going to roll this so I can see what's going on, and then I'll do it for the other side. And I hope you can see at least some of what's going on there. And I get 3 or 4 back to where the hook comes through the marabou. Get just a tad of moisture on my fingers. I think I broke some of those off pulling on them too hard. You don't want to get too rough with it, because the marabou will break as you're pulling on it. And then I usually like about 7 total bars on here. And you can use barred marabou if you want, and it makes it a little bit easier at this point, and you could just move on to the next step. But I don't have any at the moment in this color. So there we go. Now you can see that's a really mottled looking barring, like a bluegill would have. And I want to brush it up, get it all fluffed up before we move on to the next step. There we go. Just keep brushing it backwards, and you can see the speckling on the side of that. With the barring applied to both sides of the marabou, and you can see it's just more of a speckling, and you're also going to get that UV copper polar chenille coming through there when it's in the water. It gives you a real nice mottled color. Now I'm just going to kind of separate the marabou on the bottom of the fly. And again, my little damp sponge cloth is coming in real handy. I'm going to part that a little bit, because in the final fly, when I put the skid plate on here, I'm going to glue it down so that it's going to hold a little bit of separation right there. So to put the skid plate on here, and again, this is just a little triangle cut out of orange loco foam. It's got pearl on it. I'm going to drop that thread back just a little bit back from the eye of the hook, and line this up so that it is right behind the eye of the hook. And I'm going to push it down with my thumb really tight and roll it towards me, which is going to offset the thread torque as I wrap that down. And once I get the tip locked down, I can work it back, and I don't want to go all the way to the eyes, but I want to go about 3/4 of that distance right there. And you can see what I've got. That thread wrap there is a little bit off. It's not quite square, but that is not a big deal. Now I'm going to let my thread hang right there to the back of my tie-in point. And I'm going to use 3 very small drops of this liquid super glue. And I like a Loctite because with this foam, it dries almost instantly. I also like the fact that the tip nozzle of this thing is clear, so I can see the glue migrating in there as I tip it downward. Now, you want to be sure and keep a paper towel or something nearby in case you apply too much or in case of spills. But I'm going to let that flow down into the nozzle, and you can see it push that little bubble out of there. And I want to get a drop to the end of the nozzle and then just put it on there. I'm putting one on either eye towards the center, on either side of the eyes, and then I'm going to put a tiny little drop right at, let's see if I can do that without gluing my finger to the fly, right on the center at the back end of the skid plate. I almost glued my finger down there. Now I'm going to part that marabou and just lay that thing down there. And you can see that part. Now on a bluegill, they've usually got this really shiny pearl copper belly. And that right there is going to imitate that extremely well. This is an excellent pond fly. It's great in lakes too, but ponds that have a lot of bluegills, especially if they're overpopulated, this fly is killer diller. And once I get that glued down, I'm going to let it set for a few seconds. And then I'm going to take my scissors, and these are my Dr. Slick tungsten scissors. You can see they have a pretty narrow blade on them. I'm going to lay that blade on the eye of the hook and then lay it on the skid plate and just clip. Go to the other side and do exactly the same thing. Just clip. And now our eyes are cut. Going to invert the hook in the jaws one more time. Go ahead and contain my marabou again, and then pull off our barb guard. Now we're going to use the little lift, and this is a 3mm piece of foam. Again, it was cut from the tip end of this cutter. And I'm just going to lay that down, even it up with the front of the eye of the hook, get it centered, and then take my thread and wrap it right behind the point where the nose of this turns into the side. And I'm just going to put my thread down there. Now I'm going to rotate it towards me on top of the hook while I pull down on the thread, and that is going to counter the torque. So that's positioned right over the top. And give it several good wraps. Now, once it's wrapped on there, I'm going to take my whip finisher and give it 4 or 5 wrap whip finish. And the reason I do this because the back of this fly takes so much abuse from the crusher teeth that bass have. They just shred it, and that's the reason that I put Solarez Duro Finish doming resin on the back of that. I put a thin coat on there and cure it completely, and that makes this last about 3 times longer than it normally would. So I can get 12 to 15 bass on this thing before it just becomes shredded. If I leave it open where it's just the foam, 4 or 5 fish and this becomes trashed, especially right here where it curves upward. So now I'm going to put this, and I'm going to position it exactly the same as I did the lift. I'm going to bring my thread right behind the taper. You can see that there. And since I've got that lift on there, I don't have to rotate the back as far towards me while I torque on the thread, because the lift actually helps to hold that in place. I don't want a ton of wraps on there. I want to get 4 or 5, and then again I'm going to whip finish it. Just do a quick little whip finish. Da-da-da, and clip that off. Now we want to put this down over the hook, and this is what we're looking for right here. So with this just pressed against that, I'm going to drop that. I've got my right finger right against the back, and I've got it touching the lift piece of foam. I'm going to lower that down onto the hook and then press it really hard, and that's going to leave an impression in there. I hope you can see that. Now I'm going to take my scissors, and in the center of the piece of foam, even with the back of that impression, which is right here, get that out of there, it's right here, that's where I want my hole, because I want the foam to sit right here. So I'm just making a tiny hole from that side. I don't even know if you can see that. And then I'm going to come to the other side with my scissors, and pulling upward on that, I'm just going to slide my scissors in there to where I've got about 1/8 of an inch hole. You do not want a big giant hole in there. It's going to end up tearing as you fish it, so we want to keep it as small as possible to start out with. And then you just slide the hook point through there. And that is the shape of the fly. And we got a couple other things to do here. Number one, I want to just take a little bit of Solarez flex resin and put a drop right there over the thread, because when you start swimming this through timber and brush, that thread is the first thing to shred. So I'm putting that on there just to give it durability. I just want to make sure the surface is covered. I don't want a lot of bulk. Now for using Solarez, I like to use these UV eliminating safety glasses, as is recommended by the makers of Solarez. Just hit that for a second from a few inches away, and then let it sit for a few more seconds. It's recommended 15 seconds. I find about 10 seconds is good. And then I can move in to about 3 or 4 inches away from the Solarez and hit it again just for a second. And I know this takes a little bit more time rather than just cooking it all the way through, but it does make that flex especially a lot more durable, and it makes it actually rubbery. Now I've let that set again, and now I'm going to cook it. I'm going to cook it with the light right down on top of it, and I'm rotating it to make sure that I'm getting light directly into the sides of that. And you can see, even with these glasses, it's very bright, bouncing off of that white foam. Alright, now that we've got that cured, we're good to go on that. Get those stylish glasses off, and we're going to do the very last step, which is to add a roller swivel. Now the trade-off with this fly, because it is so weedless, is that it spins when you cast it. And I have tried everything, and when I started trimming the eyes to where they're tapered, like these are, it helped tremendously. But I still was having trouble, like after an hour or so fishing this thing, I noticed my leader, even a heavy 20 or 25 pound leader, was starting to get twists in it. So I started adding this little roller swivel. Bye-bye twist. I have no more problem. So I'm going to rig this, and if you happen to purchase these from me, I send them out pre-rigged, and I'm using 17 pound Trilene XL, and this stuff is super tough. So I'm going to put this on here with a Palomar knot, and the reason I do that is because it makes the tag end point back towards the fly, so that if you're fishing through mosses, you're not going to get moss wads on your swivel. So I've just looped that over, and I've got a substantial loop of about 4 inches, and it's just pushed through the eye of that swivel. And I just want to demonstrate this knot for anybody who hasn't seen it before. Now, between my finger and thumb is the swivel with this loop of line through it, and I'm just going to make an overhand loop knot. Now you see what we've got. Now I'm going to take that swivel and push it through the loop. Ooh, I gotta make it stay there. This thing is so tiny it's hard to work with. There we go. Push it through there, through that end loop, and then just kind of slide that up. Now before you cinch that all the way up, there's 2 things you want to know. Once that starts to bind, put lots and lots of moisture on it, or my favorite, chapstick. I use a little chapstick, put it on my thumb and forefinger, and rub that on there. In the field, I've got that on my lips all the time, and I'll just run it through my lips. But I'm not going to do that here. Now, to make sure that I get a good cinch on that, I'm going to pull it onto my whip finisher and then just pull that down. And you can see that chapstick acts as a wonderful lubricant. I've got the main line pulled down tight. Now I'm just going to cinch that down. There we go. The tag end is now cinched. The main line is cinched. And then when I clip this tag, you see that it is going to be pointing towards the fly, so you're not going to get any weeds hung up on that. Now I'm just going to make, in the main line, a loop, and it just needs to be 2 to 3 inches from the swivel. We'll take the tag in, lift the foam, slide it through the eye, and then put that tag in through the loop that we made. Pull it down, and that's what we've got now. Now I'm going to wrap this tag in, which is very long. I'm going to have to cut it 4 or 5 times around the main line. That's 5 right there. Now I'm going to take it and run it right back through the loop that I made on the main line before threading it through the eye, and the loop that was made when we threaded it through the eye. And I'm not sure how much of this you can see, but I've still got that chapstick on my fingers tips, and that's one of the reasons it was so hard to handle that. And I'm kind of holding those twists so they slide down on each other. There we go. And then you just cinch everything down. Cinch that back. If you need to coax it a little bit, take your pliers or hemostats, pull that tag in backwards, and you can see it is also pointing back, so it's not going to get hung up on weeds. And that, my friends, is the fly I call the Trespasser. And you can see by the shape, it just torpedoes through anything. There's nothing there to get hung on, but let me get that hook positioned in there. When a fish grabs it, it collapses down very easily. It's just, I mean, that's just, it slides right down and around the back of that hook. And then once you get the fish off, just slide it right back up. Because of the design, even when this hole gets a little worn out and it drifts, the foam still keeps the point straight up. Now this thing is so weedless that if you backcast it into a tree, if you just wiggle it a little bit and then pop it, it will come right out. And the marabou in the water has got just a ton of movement. You can see just by me waving my hands how much movement that stuff has got. It's a very, very effective fly. All you need to do is change the colors up and tie a few of these things up, put them in the water, and see how they do for you. This is a really, really tantalizing fly for fish who are very, not very aggressive. They're lethargic because it will sit in the water and just a little bit of ripple on the surface will make this marabou move. And so I've found that if you're not just crashing it through weeds, if the fish are not being aggressive, let it sit. I've let this thing sit for as much as 2 minutes before, watching a fish that was eyeing it, and then give it just a little bit of a twitch. They'll nail it. So there you have it, the fly known as the Trespasser. Until next time, peace, love, and fly fishing, my friends.